Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this basketball season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projection for a wide variety of stats, and place your entry. It's as easy as that. If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with just a few taps. Easy gameplay, quick withdrawals, and injury insurance on your picks are what make Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Ready to test your skills? Join the Prize Picks community of more than 7 million players who have already signed up. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/get100 and use code GET100. That's code GET100 at prizepicks.com/get100 for a first deposit matchup to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy.
Welcome to the second episode of the Meet the Mancunian podcast, Season 2. The Meet the Mancunian podcast takes you on a weekly journey around the local community in Manchester. Season 2 has an interesting lineup of inspiring guests making a social or community impact in the city. Presented by Deepa Thomas Sutcliffe, Newbie Mancunian. Tune in every week for your weekly dose of inspiration. Curious about the LGBT community? Learn more from radio and podcast host Emma Goswell. I'm delighted to introduce my guest, Emma Goswell, a radio and podcast host and also the author of a book. Thank you, Emma, for joining me today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
I'm hoping to learn a lot from you because you're very experienced in this podcasting world, aren't you?
I've been around the block a few times, yes.
So tell us about how you found your passion for first radio and then about podcasting.
Yeah, it's funny actually. It goes back to the pre-digital ages of the sort of early mid-90s. I moved to Manchester in 96 and someone gave me a little thing that they'd ripped out of the Pink paper, which is now a website, but it used to be an actual newspaper. And it said that the BBC were looking for people to volunteer in a programme called Gay Talk. And someone just gave it to me and said, Emma, you'd be really good at this. And I'd never, ever declared any interest or love of radio. I'd been into journalism. I'd run the Student Union magazine. I'd done a degree in media studies. And then essentially I'd been unemployed for quite a long time. I ended up being a photographer. But I'd never gone, I really want to work in radio until someone gave me this sort of job advert. Or it's a volunteer advert, actually. And I went along to the BBC and said, I think I need to work on this programme. And it was the best thing I ever did because I realised that broadcast journalists and people that work in radio just get to talk to people and interview them and get to go in their houses and literally get to have a front seat in history. And it's the most fascinating job. And I just took to it like a duck to water and I absolutely loved it. And within a few weeks, I was asking everybody in the newsroom that would let me ask them, how did you get into this? And how do I go about getting into this? I need to do this for a career. And then it was a very long journey because even though I had a degree in media studies, that wasn't enough because I wanted to go down the journalism route. So I had to then do a postgrad in broadcast journalism. And then it was a very long route to getting a job in radio because it ain't an easy thing. But that's how it all started for me, really.
That's amazing. And, I have a similar background. I did mass communication way, way back. I finished in 96, but I have been working in communications throughout, but never done content creations my first time. So very interesting. But tell us about how podcasting found you. So you told us about radio, but maybe a little bit about how you found.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think most people do the opposite route to me. So a lot of people, the attraction with podcasting is, look, there you are. You've got a laptop. You've got a little bit of software. You've got Wi-Fi. You are doing a podcast. You don't need loads of equipment. You don't need the money of a radio station. You don't necessarily need the experience to do a very basic podcast. You can just turn on your laptop and start recording if you wanted to. But I've sort of done it back to, and most people do that and then maybe get into radio. But I got into radio in sort of by the late 90s. I was working in radio full time and worked as a newsreader to begin with, and as a broadcast journalist, then as a producer, then eventually as a presenter. And I was loving it, and I worked for loads of different stations, like Imagine FM in Stockport, D106.3 in Chester, BBC Radio Manchester, and then Gadio is where I ended up. And I was doing all these things and having a whale of a time doing radio. And then what happened was a friend of mine who was also working in radio said to me, Emma, I think you should do a podcast. And I think you should do a podcast about people's coming out stories, people in the LGBT plus community talking about how they came to terms with their gender identity or their sexuality and talking about how it panned out for them. And because I'm an idiot, I just went, oh, I don't know, Sam, that doesn't sound very interesting to me. Is anyone interested in my coming out story? I don't see why they would be. And luckily she talked me around, because doing coming out stories, the podcast, is probably the most important thing that I've ever done in my life. Forget all those different radio shows that I've hosted or shows that I've produced. I think my legacy will be the podcast Coming Out Stories, because over the last, it's over 3.5 years now, I have collected, nearly 100 different stories from people across the world, and it's been so important to find those people and give them the platform of just telling their stories, and in a long format way as well. So the thing about radio is I've interviewed politicians, I've interviewed like world leaders, I've interviewed pop stars, I've interviewed authors, I've interviewed all these people, but you don't get free reign. You are always within the constraints of that station. And it might be, if you're on the BBC, you might be allowed to do an interview for sort of, 7 to 10 minutes. But, on Gadio, we were told to keep interviews to sort of 3 to 5 minutes. So, yeah, you're doing a good interview and it's great and it fits the format of the station. But, at the end of it, you've got to play the latest hit from Dua Lipa and you've got to hit the news jingle on time and you've got to, fit within the format. Right. Whereas a podcast just lets you talk. It's just beautiful, really. And I can talk, as you can tell. And I like to listen to other people who can talk as well. And I don't want the constraints of, we have to leave it there. We've got to hit the traffic news now. I just didn't want that, really. So I enjoy a long form interview, which is why I love podcasting.
That's amazing. So tell us about how you got involved with the whole LGBT community, or the movement, that the right term that you think is best.
Well, I think any LGBT person kind of ends up involved in it whether they want to or not. When I came out, I was 18. It was still the 1980s. Things were not great for gay people. We're in the middle of the AIDS pandemic. Gay men were being treated as though they were paedophiles and diseased. It was a horrific time to be a gay person. And I went to university in the middle of this. Went to university in Liverpool in 1990. And it probably wasn't initially just a political act. It was probably, I need to meet other LGBT people. It wasn't all altruistic. It was, I need to get a girlfriend. How do I do that? I'll join the, as it was called then, the Lesbian and Gay Society. And actually, what's hilarious about joining that society is when I went to university, I thought that I was bisexual. Turns out I'm not very bisexual. But I said, you need to now change the name of the society to the Lesbian, Gay and Bisexual Society, which they then did. And I've no doubt that now it will be the LGBTQ plus society. And through that, it wasn't all just about, we're going to, because we're in Liverpool, we used to get the minibus over with the LGB Society and go over to the Hacienda, go to Flesh, go to all the gay bars in Manchester. But also we would get involved in all the political things as well. So they helped politicise me and say, right, Emma, there's this march going on in London. We're going to organise transport. We're going to go out and march against Clause 28, or the fact that gay men still don't have an equal age of consent, which was going on in the early 90s when I was involved in that. So from a teenager, really, I was marching on Parliament, or marching up and down the streets of Manchester, or marching up and down the streets of Liverpool with my placards and, taking part in the prides, but also being very aware that there was still a lot to protest about. It was, when I was at university, gay men had to be 21. I've spoken to gay men who have been arrested and criminalised because they were 21 and had a boyfriend who was 19. And that was illegal in the night. You can't believe it now, can you, really? It's not that long ago. But people were criminalised for things that we now just totally accept as a normal part of life. So it was very easy and very important to get involved in campaigning for LGBT rights, because there was so much wrong. There really was.
Saying that unfortunately there are parts of the world where it's still not quite accepted. So I'm
Well,
hoping
illegal, I think you'll find is the word. Yeah.
in some places, yes. But I would like to actually hopefully educate people a little bit through this podcast on, some of the concerns that you think are facing the LGBTQ plus community today.
So what was the question? Yeah. What do we still need to fight for today? Um, yeah, that's part of the point of doing the podcast, was to show to people, yeah, it might be 2022, but people are still facing homophobia and transphobia and biphobia and bigotry. I spoke to a young lad from Longsight who literally just a few years ago got thrown out of his home for being gay. He had very non-understanding, well, I think his parents are separated actually, but he had a very non-understanding mother, and threw her out. She threw him out of home. Ended up living with his grandparents. Then they found out he was gay. Then they also threw him out of home. And I work for the Albert Kennedy Trust as well. As a volunteer, which is a charity set up specifically to help those people, to help homeless LGBT youth, because it is still happening. In our country, we think that we're progressive, we think that people are educated, we think that we've got tolerance and equality, and yet young people are still being made homeless because they're gay. It's unbelievable, but it's still happening. And bullying still goes on in schools. Young people still think it's acceptable to say, oh, that's so gay, when they mean, oh, that's so rubbish. And that's in our country. There's a lot worse things going on around the world. We look at what was going on in Russia just a few years ago, and they were rounding up gay men and putting them in camps, in like concentration camps, and interrogating their parents and arresting their parents and arresting people if they didn't report on their gay children. You have to look what's going on in parts of the Middle East, in Iran, where they're throwing gay men off the top of buildings and killing them. I mean, I know several asylum seekers in Manchester who ended up here because they're gay, because their partners have been murdered and they fled the countries in fear of their lives. It's absolutely terrifying what is going on across the world. It really is. So, if you think that we've reached a point of equality and humanity just says, oh yeah, gay people are great. No, we are not there yet by a million miles. So there is still a lot of work to be done, and work to be done internationally, work to be done in this country, work to be done in schools in particular. And, thankfully there are a lot of organisations and charities doing that, but a lot more needs to be done, unfortunately.
Thank you. What was the name of the charity you mentioned again, which you volunteer for?
Oh, they're called the AKT, which stands for the Albert Kennedy Trust. And Albert Kennedy was a young gay man who was chased off, he was being chased, and they don't know if he was thrown off or if he jumped to avoid being home centre, and he fell to his death. And actually, if you walk down the street, near Chawton Street, near the gay village, there is a plaque on the floor, which is a rainbow mosaic, and that is to mark the spot where Albert Kennedy lost his life. And then people set up a charity in his memory to make sure that young LGBT people were never, living on the streets and in fear of their lives. And that is a national charity across the UK now.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So, through all the work that you're doing for the LGBT community, your podcast on coming out, I think you've got a book on its way.
No, the book's out. The book is out. That is simply called Coming Out Stories, and that is basically the podcast in a book form. We got approached by a publisher who said we wanted to do a collection of LGBT people telling their stories, and basically you've done all the hard work, so could we make it into a book? And we thought they were joking to begin with, but it turns out it was true, and we now have a book that we've edited, and it's been out for just over a year now, actually. Unfortunately, we had to bring it out in the pandemic, so we couldn't have a big launch party, but that's a small price to pay. But yeah, it is out there now, wherever you get your books. Coming Out Stories.
For sure. So tell us a little bit about, what impact you made so far.
Well, I don't think that's for me to say, really, because I was just one person on all of these different marches. I wasn't the one that organised all these marches or started any of these campaigns. But hopefully, I've gone some way to, I hate this word, just normalise LGBT life and just talk about it in the public sphere as well, and not be remaining in a bubble. So talking about it on the BBC, putting it out on podcasts, being part of Gadio, which is the world's biggest LGBT radio station, which happens to be based in Manchester, and just being really visible, because that is so important for other young people who are growing up to say, look, that person's done all right in their life and they're happy to talk about it and just be open and share the fact that they're gay with whoever wants to whoever wants to hear it. So in terms of actual impact, I literally couldn't say, and it wouldn't be for me to say, but hopefully, particularly the podcast. I think the reason we did it was so that if there was a young person, for example, somewhere who didn't have any other gay people to talk to, they could at least go online and listen to other people's stories, so, and hopefully, whoever you are, whatever the colour of your skin is, whether you're a man or a woman or a non-binary person, you can go on there and find a story that you identify with. And I think there's something really comforting in that. Obviously your story's not going to pan out exactly the same, but I really hope that we have really helped some people, and in fact we know we have, because we do get some lovely emails occasionally from people all over the world, bizarrely. So I've had a lot of listeners in America, and which is a much more repressed place than they would lead you to believe. And people really thanking us, saying it's been really, really amazing to listen to all these stories. And we have random people just messaging us saying, and I'd like to give back and I'd like to tell my story as well. And we know that people listen in places where it's illegal to be gay, because you get all these statistics when you do a podcast, don't you? And hilariously, or not hilariously, at one point we were looking at our statistics, and in terms of, there's a certain category of podcasts which you can put yourself in, which is sexuality and relationships, and we were the number one podcast in Tajikistan. Wow. Can you believe that? I think, forget everything else, that's the best piece of news I've ever had in my life. I was like, this is amazing. Who knew people in Tajikistan were looking out for, LGBT podcasts? But they must be.
I think this is going back to what people are talking about today in any minority or any community, where you're saying that representation matters, role models matter. And if I hear that other people can share their story, I will be more comfortable. And that's what you're doing. And that's so amazing.
I think so. And, the same was true at Gadia. I remember we had a few emails from a guy who was living in Iran. And he said, he couldn't do anything to acknowledge his sexuality because he knew that it would get him into a lot of trouble, if not physical violence and danger. So, he hasn't got the option like we have in Manchester to go down to Canal Street and meet other gay people. He couldn't even talk about it to his closest family. But what he could do was go online and find a gay radio station. And he did, and he managed to email us and thank us for all the work that we were doing, which was just mind-blowing, to be honest.
Absolutely. So how can interested people reach out to you and learn more? Where will they find you? Where will they find your podcast? Where will they find your book?
Well, you find your podcast wherever you get your good podcasts. I quite often will listen on... you can get the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. So, for example, I quite often listen to podcasts on Spotify, but you can get them on any other platform where you find your podcasts. Just search for Coming Out Stories. We are Coming Out Stories Pod on Twitter, and I'm at Emma Goswell on Twitter. I think I'm the Goswell on Instagram, but I'm absolutely rubbish at Instagram because I'm too old for it, probably. But yeah, I am the Goswell. Where can you find the book? Well, this is an important thing. Actually, here's a possible future guest for you, because I'd like you not to buy it from that big website that might sound the same as a big river in South America. I'd like you to buy from independent bookstores. And particularly LGBT bookstores. So you may have heard of Gay's the Word in London. Well, in Manchester, we've got our very own LGBT bookshop last summer. So it's called Queer Lit. So I would prefer it if you looked up Queer Lit online and ordered the book from them.
Of course. So what advice would you have for people looking to start something similar in their local community, maybe in another part of the world?
It's something similar as in the podcast, you mean, or what do you mean?
Podcast, yeah, I guess the podcast, and I guess talking about LGBT or supporting LGBT, being a voice for LGBT communities.
Yeah, I'd say just go for it and don't be afraid and never let anyone tell you that your story is not valid and is not interesting. Everybody has got a story to tell. So if you've got an idea, find out how to make a podcast and just go and do it. This is what I love about podcasting. There are millions of them out there now. It's almost difficult to go and find exactly what you want to find because there are so many of them. But that is also the beauty as well. You don't need to be part of a huge institution like the BBC. If you've got a great idea, go and make it. Go and talk to people. There are fascinating people out there in the world for you to go and talk to and share their stories. Other people will be interested. Just do it.
Totally love that. Thank you. So I'm going to shift gear and go into my signature questions, which I ask all my guests. What do you
Love
love
it.
most? What do you love the most about Manchester?
I think it's the fact that it's a city that doesn't take any shit. And I think Andy Burnham, our mayor, exemplifies that as well. He won't take any shit from the government, will he? It's like, no, we're Manchester. We do things differently, And that was a brilliant quote from Tony Wilson, wasn't it? We do things differently here. We do things our own way. We do not apologise for the way that we do it. I've got a brilliant quote on my wall outside, actually, in my hallway, which says, Manchester, a city that thinks a table is for dancing on. And I just love that quote because it's like, yeah, we're up for a party, but also it just shows we do things differently, and we don't care how you do it in the rest of the world. We're going to do it the Mancunian way, and we're going to enjoy it, and we're going to crack on. Thank you very much. Don't even judge us because we don't care what you think of us. And I love that sort of attitude about Manchester.
That is lovely. I love this philosophy.
Yeah.
Where's your favorite place in Manchester?
Yeah, well, am I allowed to have two?
Of course.
Yeah, because I find this really difficult. Because when he first suggested that as a question, I thought, I don't know. And I suddenly thought, I really like Burton Road in West Didsbury because I live quite near it. And I think, because I'm such a foodie and I love just going out and about, and I just love the fact that it's like a little microcosm of everything. So I love Thai food. I think you've got two Thai restaurants. You've got Nepalese, you've got Indian, you've got Persian, you've got Spanish, you've got everything on there. And you've got the most amazing cake shop as well. So as a foodie, I feel very lucky to live in West Didsbury, so I can have easy access to Burton Road. So I particularly love that. But then I also like just getting out and about. So I would say somewhere like Greenbooth Reservoir, which is in the hills above Rochdale. There are some stunning parts of Greater Manchester where you can go out with your dog and you just think that you were in the Lake District, and it's absolutely spellbindingly beautiful. And you get up on those hills and you just look down on the city below you and you're just surrounded by lakes or reservoirs, and it is utterly spellbinding and beautiful. If you get a nice day, obviously a lot of the time it is crap, but and on a nice day you could think you're in paradise.
Love that. And your dog must be enjoying all those walks you're taking.
Oh yeah, he's very lucky.
What's the most important life lesson you've learned?
To appreciate everything. To appreciate every single moment. I'm actually getting emotional now because I learned that from my sister, and we lost her to breast cancer in 2020. And she had a terrible, well, we all had a terrible 2020, didn't we? But she had the worst. She knew she was dying. We couldn't bloody go anywhere because of COVID. Her friends couldn't visit her. But she made the most of that last summer that she had. And she just taught me to appreciate every single thing, every single day that you have with your health, with your family. Even if you can't go out, if you can just look out the window and see a blue sky and appreciate nature, then appreciate it. There is so much we have to be grateful for. There really is. There really is.
So moving. And thank you for sharing that lovely moment with us as well, that your sister had this beautiful summer before she passed. If someone wrote a book on your life, what would they title it?
Oh, God. And I can only go with the first thing that came into my mind, because I always used to think this. When I worked at Gadio, I was actually in charge of volunteer recruitment. And believe it or not, we always really struggled to find lesbians. And in fact, we had more straight people volunteering for us than lesbians. So quite often, even though I really tried to, and I don't know what the issue was, but I think maybe it had a stereotype as being a station for gay men, and which I don't think was the case. But anyway, maybe it had that stereotype. I don't know. So quite often we'd been these most amazing places like parties or events or things, and it would just be me and a load of gay men. And so I always said that if I had an autobiography, I'd call it The Last Lesbian Left Standing.
I love that name. It is very, definitely a book you should be writing at some point in your life.
Yeah.
It's a great one. Thank you very much, Emma, for talking to me and my listeners. And, I hope you can introduce us to more people on Meet the Mancunian.
I know so many people in Manchester, I can't even tell you. You could, if I got my contacts book out now, you'd be talking from now until Christmas 2030, I tell you.
Fantastic. I'll follow up with you on this, maybe a few names, not the full content book, just a few names that might be interesting. Yeah, thank you so much for talking to us.
I just want to say thank you so much for asking me, and I think this is such a genuinely great idea for a podcast, because I do consider myself a Mancunian, even though clearly I haven't got a Mancunian accent, and I moved here in 1996. So I consider myself an honorary Mancunian. So thank you for making me feel even more Mancunian. And I just think it's a great idea just to find other Mancunians and inspire the world with our Mancunian attitudes.
Absolutely. Like you said, we do things differently here. So let's take a little bit of that and share the love around the world.
Exactly.
Thank you for talking to me and my listeners. Thank you all for listening from so many countries around the globe. I'm so glad to know you're finding some inspiration from the amazing Mancunian guests who feature here. Tune in every Tuesday for a new episode. Please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. I would also be grateful if you could share this podcast with a friend or a family member. Thank you.